The prophet Zechariah talks about Jerusalem being a stone that is too heavy for the nations to lift, a cup of trembling. And I think the way that governments treat Jerusalem is exactly that. It's totally irrational.
Well, welcome to the podcast today. My name is Jeff, and I am your host today. And we're talking today about Israel on trial. We have a returning guest with us, Andrew Tucker, who is the director for the Hague Initiative for International Cooperation. Andrew is a graduate of the universities of Melbourne and Oxford and has over 20 years of experience as an attorney in Australia, the UK, and the Netherlands. From 2004 to 2018, he served as executive director of Christians for Israel International, and he currently serves as editor-in-chief of the global publication Israel and Christians Today. In 2017, he co-founded the Hague Initiative for International Cooperation, a network of experts in the fields of international law, history, and religion. Think challenges the misuse of international law to delegitimize the state of Israel. Andrew lives in the Netherlands with his wife and 4 children and a dog. So, Andrew, welcome back to the podcast today.
Thank you so much, Jeff. It's good to be with you again.
Well, it's great to have you, and we want to start by just talking a little bit about the significance of this year. Israel is celebrating its 75th birthday this spring, 2023. And as an international lawyer and a Christian who has actively been connected to the nation of Israel for many years, what are some of the things you celebrate about Israel? What makes Israel stand out among the nations of the earth, in your opinion?
Oh, that's such an awesome question, Jeff, because it's something we don't talk about very much, is it? We talk a lot about what's not good about Israel, but we don't spend enough time thinking about the positive sides. And I think it's great to start with that question because there is so much about Israel that is unique. It is, I think, the greatest modern miracle of the 20th century really is the restoration of the Jewish people and the creation of the state of Israel. It's a state where I believe that over 150 nationalities are represented. We have Jews coming from the north, the south, the east, and the west, as the Bible says. Literally, they've come from Europe, many countries of Europe. They've come from Russia in the north. They've come from China and Japan and many countries of the east, right even down to my home country, Australia, New Zealand, the Pacific Islands. Jews who had been dispersed in the diaspora for thousands of years are coming home. And that, I think, is unique in history. There are some other countries where there's been a diaspora, like Greece, for example, but to have so many nations. And then this melting pot, really, of all these nationalities. You have Ethiopian Jews and Chinese Jews, Mizrahi Jews and Sephardic Jews and Ashkenazi Jews from different parts of the world, but also different streams of Judaism and different traditions, all having to somehow come together and build a nation. And not only a nation, but a nation in the midst of conflict. Israel was born in war. The Arab world was fighting against the recreation of this Jewish homeland from the very beginning after the First World War. So in 1948, when Israel was founded, it was in the midst of conflict, and the very day after it was attacked by 5 Arab armies, all intent on destroying it. And it survived a number of these wars of annihilation. I don't think there's any nation in the world that has done that. And then it's become a modern superpower, hasn't it? It's become a global actor. it is one of the greatest success startup nations in the world. Mm-hmm. It has a military that is unsurpassed, and leaders in medicine and science and in the arts and in so many other fields. I think Israel has the greatest number of Nobel Peace Prize winners, or Nobel Prize winners across the scope of disciplines than any other country in the world. So they're just some of the things. What I love about Israel is its diversity, its richness. And yes, there are huge problems between Jewish groups internally, as we're seeing at the moment with the political constitutional crisis in Israel, with the Arabs and the Jews. There's a big issue about the Palestinians that hopefully will be solved. But those things, I think, shouldn't overshadow the amazing gift that Israel really is to the world. And I think, and I wish that the world was more aware and thankful for all that Israel contributes.
Mm-hmm. Well, I concur with all of those things that you just mentioned. And, especially the miracle of the rebirth of Israel and the fact that, Israel has been able to persevere and grow to the country that it is today. I just returned from Israel on Tuesday. And so the other thing that I would say is that, anybody that has questions about whether or not there's anything to celebrate about Israel really should go and see and visit for themselves. I think that the experience that we have interacting with Israelis when we're there and so on really does help to inform a lot of misinformation that we receive and get bombarded with in the world today. The other thing I would say, I celebrate the fact that this is the homeland of the biblical story, that the God narrative comes out of Israel and that the Messiah is the Jewish Messiah. And so all of those things stacked up with everything else you mentioned really is something to celebrate. And the fact that we can go there and visit there unimpeded and unhindered, and see these amazing places and be able to learn together about those things really is, in my mind, an incredible thing to be able to celebrate. It's also kind of a beacon of democracy in the Middle East. And I think that that's always been something that I've appreciated about it as well. I know there's a little bit of discussion about that happening in the country right now with judicial reform and so on, but many, many things that we can celebrate about Israel. Now, Andrew, I want to ask you a question that I haven't actually researched the answer to. I don't normally ask questions that I don't know the answer to, but I'm going to ask it right now. Biblically, what does Israel's 75th year as a nation mean?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not sure that there is a biblical significance of 75 years. But what is interesting, I think, 70 is a very biblical number, isn't it? 70, 72.
Yes.
It's a full generation. It's a period of fullness. I think personally, and I don't pin it to a specific year or date, but there is something about the fullness of time after the creation of the State of Israel. And I tie it, and I'm speculating a little bit here, but it's my personal view is that, when Jesus said that Jerusalem would be trampled on until the time of the fullness of the Gentiles has come. And I really feel that we're at that period now where there is the fullness of the Gentiles is coming to an end. They have trampled on Jerusalem. We as nations have trampled on Jerusalem. We still are doing it. We're going to talk a little bit more about that, I think, today, because we're doing it in the international institutions. But the Lord is restoring Jerusalem and giving it as an eternal possession to the Jewish people. It belongs to the Lord God himself, but he's giving the Jewish people back to the land. because of the coming of Messiah. And so I think the time of the Gentiles is getting pretty close to an end. And 75 years after the restoration of the nation as a state, I sense is very critical. But again, I'm not someone for specific dates and years. There are others who are more into probably biblical prophetic timing than I'm always a little bit averse to being too specific about dates. But I think in a broad perspective, there's the conflict around Jerusalem, I think, is coming to a peak, to a kind of a crisis.
Mm-hmm. Well, no one's trying to pigeonhole you here, Andrew, but we do appreciate your thoughts, and I think that those are very intriguing things that you've mentioned, and we will see, won't we? I mean, that's the real test. Now, Andrew, as an international lawyer, what is your perspective of how Israel is treated overall by the nations of the earth? Are they treated fairly or justly for the most part?
Well, that's the $1 million question. I think the answer is absolutely not. It's interesting. I think Israel is the most contended state in the world. Of course, we had apartheid South Africa, which during the 70s and 80s became the focus point of international attention as a pariah state, an illegitimate state. But Israel has tended to be that always. It has never, since its creation in May 1948, been generally accepted as a member of the community of nations. It was not even a recognized member of the groups within the United Nations until very, very recently. The Arab world has had a policy of refusing to recognize its existence until we've seen the very recent normalization agreements.
Right.
So it's had this very isolated, unaccepted position in the community of nations. It's always been kicked around like a football, the Russians and the Soviets. And I think the West as well, we've kind of used Israel to suit our own purposes. Our policies change depending on what suits us. If we think it's appropriate to side with Israel, we will, but the next day we'll decide we'll back its enemies. So I think the world has been extremely fickle in its approach to Israel. And it's been, as I say, very, very isolated within the community of nations. The UN system, I suppose, represents the community of nations, and it's a very political organ. And Israel has been on its own. As I say, it was not a member of the group of nations until about 10 years ago. And it finally became accepted as a member of the Western group. And you were starting to see a bit more respect, I think, for Israel. But the number of resolutions that are passed year in, year out by all of these UN agencies and bodies and organizations and institutions far exceeds for Israel any other nation. It's condemned more than all other nations put together every year in the UN Human Rights Council.
Yeah.
Well, Israel is definitely not perfect, but it's certainly not the worst human rights offender in the world. So there's something very perverse, very strange, I think, about the way that Israel is treated. It's very irrational. And, again, to sort of bring it back, I think, to the Bible, I think, the prophet Zechariah talks about Jerusalem being a stone that is too heavy for the nations to lift, a cup of trembling. And I think the way that governments treat Jerusalem is exactly that. It's totally irrational.
Mm-hmm.
There's no reason why the world should be so obsessed with one city as it is with Jerusalem. It doesn't go around condemning the Dutch for choosing Amsterdam as its capital, or the Americans for choosing, Washington as their capital. But no, Israel is condemned for choosing Jerusalem as its capital. So I think it's a stone that the nations are trying to lift but can't.
Mm-hmm. Well, and they didn't really choose Jerusalem, did they? It's amazing when God says that a city is his, how much opposition comes as a result of that. Now,
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Now, do you feel that there's ever a possibility that Israel's legitimacy and sovereignty as a state would be threatened or under attack? And do we have any examples of that?
Oh, well, I think it is, Jeff. It is being attacked, as we speak. Its very legitimacy, its right to exist, as I say, has always been challenged. And if you think about, what is the legitimacy or the sovereignty of states? Well, the UN Charter talks about a couple of things. Mm-hmm. It talks about political inviolability, that is, the right of states to determine their own internal affairs. That's what state sovereignty is about.
Right.
And secondly, it's about territorial integrity, the right to have and defend territory. And those two things are constantly challenged with Israel. Everybody has an opinion or a view about how Israel should run its internal affairs. And everybody has a view about what its borders should be. And those two things Israel is not allowed to decide on. So in that respect, I think its legitimacy is being undermined continuously. And I think at the moment, it is taking an extreme form in the cases that are going on at the moment in the international courts here in The Hague, in the Netherlands, which I think is a frontal attack on the sovereignty of the State of Israel. The courts, the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, are both hearing cases at the moment where they will decide on the status of Jerusalem, potentially. They will decide on the borders of Israel. They will decide whether Israel can be a Jewish state or not. Now, these are fundamental issues.
Yeah.
So you can compare it a little bit like the boycott of South Africa. Everything was done to destroy the apartheid system and to recreate South Africa. Well, that's what's happening today. The world community is determined to, and I think many nations don't realize they're doing it, but they are undermining the sovereign existence of the Jewish state of Israel.
Wow. Well, that's alarming. And, I'm learning today as we talk. I appreciate you kind of giving those two very sort of key criteria: internal affairs, being able to decide on their own internal affairs, and then territories. And really, those are huge issues in the modern state of Israel. And I'm wondering, why? Why do you think the UN is constantly criticizing and condemning Israel? Are their accusations ever justifiable in your opinion?
Well, you have to realize the UN it is nothing more than a political platform for nations to get together and talk about things. So, it's a constant place where they're talking about, anything and everything. And Israel is something that unifies a kind of a vast array of nations, from the political left to the political extreme right. And I think one way of looking at it is by looking at groups or blocks of nations. So, for example, one of the most influential groups in the UN is the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the OIC. That is the grouping. It's like a mini United Nations, the grouping of Islamic nations. There are 56 of them, as far as I'm aware at the moment. Now, that's a block of more than a quarter of UN member states. They have, as one of their core objectives, the liberation of Jerusalem. It's in their charter, is to liberate Jerusalem from the Zionists. And that reflects, of course, the Islamic agenda of liberating Islamic territory from foreign occupation. So from their perspective, Israel is occupied territory that must be liberated. So that's one block. And of course, you have all the African states who are very dependent upon many of the Islamic states for economically. So politically, they will tend to vote in accordance with these kinds of things. And then you have the European bloc, which is an area that I'm very concerned about, and we're doing a lot of work on here in Europe, is ever since the Second World War, and particularly since the 1970s, I think the Yom Kippur War in 73, the Europeans have had a strong pro-Palestinian policy. And I think there are many reasons for it. It's got to do with the Holocaust, I think, which Europe never recovered from. I think there's a kind of a guilt complex in Europe where they feel guilty for allowing the creation of a Jewish state at the expense of the Palestinians. So they're putting a lot of money, a lot of energy and resources into creating a Palestinian state. And they say this is good for Israel, it's good for the world, it's good for everybody, and we'll have peace in the Middle East once this state is created with East Jerusalem as its capital. That's European policy.
Wow.
So they're allied in a way with the Islamic world, although their worldviews are entirely different. And there's no grouping of nations which is, and I think this is another aspect, there's no grouping of nations which is coherently developing policy around Western Judeo-Christian values. So even European policy, it's nothing to do anymore with Judeo-Christian values. It's just got to do with the economic interests of Europe. So in that way, because Israel, I think, is the end of the day, its legitimacy is very much connected with the right of the Jewish people to exist as a Jewish homeland. It becomes, I think, there's just not many states that identify with it sufficiently to counteract the economic and the political arguments of siding with Israel's enemies. Wow. So it means that you have a minority of states in the UN who are able to push an agenda through time and again. And it's always a minority, but they get sufficient other states to come on board with them. I come from Australia, and I think Australia is a good example of this. We're very wishy-washy in the way that we vote in the UN. We tend to stand up for Israel a little bit, but only when it suits us. And if the pressure is too big, then we'll flip and we'll condemn Israel again.
Yeah. Now, this is, it's always a bit of a confusion for me, but it's the way of the world, it seems. But we've established the fact that the accusations against Israel and the condemnations Israel receives at the United Nations in proportion to what other nations receive is very out of whack and very out of balance. Surely there must be other nations that deserve more condemnations than the state of Israel.
Yeah, of course, but that's just not the way the UN works. It's not really set up to achieve real justice. It's a place where every state votes to protect its own interests. So if it doesn't suit your interests to condemn Russia or to condemn China or to condemn Syria or North Korea or whatever else, then we'll tend not to do it. And yes, of course, it suits everybody now to condemn Putin in Russia because, he's such a blatant violator of international law. So we charge him and we bring him before the International Criminal Court. But it's very selective. It's not strategic. It's not systematic. And I think, again, Israel is condemned a lot because there are significant interests which have ideological objectives which are opposed to Israel.
Yeah.
And the strange thing is, most nations know that Israel is necessary, that it's important to have Israel as a democratic state in the Middle East, to be serving the world community in so many ways. I mean, just look at security. If Israel were not there, most nations in the world would not have the intelligence that they have about what's going on in the region. They're dependent upon Israel,
right,
and Israel's security and intelligence, and they know that. But there's a kind of a disconnect between that and the way that voting happens in New York or Geneva in the UN system, which is very much about politics and economic interests.
Well, Psalms chapter 2 or Psalm 2 talks about the nations conspiring against God's anointed. And, we've already made this comment about the fact that when God says a city is his, like Jerusalem, there's all kinds of opposition that comes. Do you feel that this verse, and others in the Bible shed any light on why the nations come against Israel?
Well, they certainly shed light on the fact that they are. I mean, there's something about the conspiring, the coalition of nations, the coming together of nations. It's funny when nations come together, bad things tend to happen. I suppose the first real example of that was the Tower of Babylon, wasn't it?
Right.
Where, nations come together, perhaps in a way for good reasons, but in the dynamic of coming together, they seek to create a world kingdom of their own without God. And I think that's kind of what's happening. I see the UN in a way as a kind of Tower of Babylon again, where we are as nations trying to create world peace and security. And, humanly speaking, and this is the way God works, isn't it? He works so differently from the way we think. But
right.
Humanly speaking, a two-state solution makes sense. Two peoples divide the territory. They'll both be happy, and there'll be no problem anymore. It's kind of simple, but that's just not the way God works. And I think that's the mystery of Jerusalem, which is what he is doing with Jerusalem is so counterintuitive. It's so different from our rational Western humanist mindset that I see a really a clash of cultures. And I think we're seeing that in Israel itself at the moment, a clash of cultures. The one culture that is looking to man to decide on, what is democracy and a humanist way of creating governments and societies, and God's way, which is based on the Bible, biblical principles. And these two things at the end of the day are incompatible.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where Israel is really clashing with the nations, I think. And I think there's a clash within the Jewish people themselves at the moment to work out what their true identity is. Are they a nation created by the United Nations, in the image of the United Nations? Or are they a nation created by God in the image of his order?
Right.
And that's, there's no, you have to make a choice in that.
Wow. Well, Andrew, we certainly appreciate all of the insights that you bring to this conversation and to the topics that we're discussing. Now, Christians for Israel and the Hague Initiative International are sponsoring an international conference very soon, or even currently, that will focus on some of these issues that we've been talking about. Israel on Trial is going to be held at The Hague, and March 29th and 30th, 2023. Tell us a little bit more about the conference. What's its focus? What are the goals? And who are some of the keynote speakers?
So the Hague is the international legal capital of the world. It's actually not the capital city of the Netherlands, that's Amsterdam, but it is the seat of government in the Netherlands. But more importantly, it's the seat of more international institutions. But there are two key ones: the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. The Court of Justice is housed in the Peace Palace in The Hague. It's a very symbolic place because it was created before the First World War to be like a temple of peace. It was the place where the nations would decide that they're not going to train for war anymore, and they created these courts. And the International Court of Justice is really the UN judicial court. And as I mentioned, there's a number of cases going on at the moment. The Palestinians are suing the United States for moving their embassy to Jerusalem. That's one case. And secondly, the General Assembly has asked the Court of Justice for an advisory opinion. They did that last December. And the court is considering that request to give an advisory opinion about the status of Israel's occupation of the territories and the status of the holy city of Jerusalem. So the court is at the moment considering this issue. The criminal court is investigating Israelis for war crimes. The war crime they're considering is the creation of settlements. In other words, Israel is regarded as potentially being war criminal, or Israeli leaders are war criminals for allowing Jews to live in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria. Now, that's how crazy things have become.
Oh, my goodness.
And we feel, because these cases are going on, we feel it's terribly important that there's a counter voice in this city, in The Hague. We're bringing together international lawyers to come together to put the case, really, for Israel, to counter some of these claims. And we hope it's the beginning of a kind of a movement whereby there will be greater traction, greater awareness that, these claims, although, again, Israel is definitely not perfect. It's not an apartheid state. The occupation is not illegal. Israel is not illegally occupying Jerusalem. And yes, the Palestinians have a right to self-determination. There has to be some kind of resolution of their conflicts. But to allege that Israel is the sole perpetrator of crimes, that Israel is the sole cause of the problem, we think is, it's not only wrong, I mean, it's just completely upside down. And there's just not many people... There's not many people who are putting the counter view, because I think we've all been seduced and overwhelmed by many in the legal community over 50 or 70 years. Sadly, many of them in Israel. The leading proponents of some of this are Israeli jurists. and we've all been bewitched, in my view.
Wow.
So that's what we're kind of doing for 2 days, Jeff, coming together to learn, to study together, to start this process, to raise a voice, not only in The Hague, but in the capital cities around the world,
Mm-hmm.
to speak out against the biased condemnation of Israel.
It just all seems so ridiculous to me to think about.
Yes.
To
I know
think,
when we talk about it like this, it does, doesn't it? But
it
it's the
does.
reality in these institutions,
Yeah.
and they don't.
Go ahead.
No, what I'm going to say is, you have all these bureaucrats in Brussels and here in The Hague and in New York, and they're all sitting. They get paid big salaries to investigate Israel as a war criminal, and they that is their worldview.
Yeah.
They've never learned any other way. They've only learned that Israel is a colonizing power. That's the paradigm that has developed over the course of 70 years. And unfortunately, Israel has not been successful in countering that. And there have been too few others who've been able, I think, to present a convincing case that this very anti-Israel view has become like the mainstream.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we're seeing the fruits of that.
It seems to have been a hugely successful propaganda machine, and the truth of the matter is, I mean, I've visited many settlements in Judea and Samaria. We've been and been in people's homes, and the biggest issue in the settlements is not Jews against Arabs. It's the opposite. They have to spend millions of dollars on security and all of these things just to exist in those places. And to think that it's called a war crime just boggles my mind. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I see so much evidence of the success of this democratic experiment in Israel. Arab Israelis who would rather live under an Israeli government than any other government. Sometimes they will only tell you that quietly. They won't, go on the record. But it seems so foreign to me that any of this kind of discussion is happening. So I applaud you for bringing thinking minds together, for raising, the flag and having a voice against this. I think it's amazing. Now, we can't all hop on a plane and go to Amsterdam, but is there any other way to sort of access some of this?
Yeah, so we're going to record the whole thing. We decided not to stream it for different reasons, but so what we're going to do is record it and we're going to share it as much as we can. So, I think what you're doing is terribly important because you are a bridge, really. You are a platform to enable people around the world to understand what's going on. So I'd love to work with you, in the future to help sort of disseminate. We'll have some great lectures, for example, by Hillel Neuer of UN Watch. He's going to be our keynote speaker. A whole bunch of, I have a great guy, Jeff Zipperstein at UCLA in California, a historian, legal scholar, German, Dutch, Australian, American people. So I think the sessions will be quite interesting, and then it could be, I think, of great interest to your audience. Well, so we should collaborate going forward to make sure that.
Absolutely. We will look forward to that. And, we're not a political organization, but our heart and desire is just to help to educate people about the issues. And, we obviously have, opinions about this, but the focus of our work is helping helping believers in the land. And we were very relieved to hear
Right.
Netanyahu's statement just yesterday that that no law will be exacted against the Christian community, and that was a real concern even when I was there last week. So good to hear those things happening internally in Israel, but there's this outside force and influence that really is an alarming thing. And I am so glad that you're giving voice to the other side of the conversation. Andrew, it's been fantastic to have you on the show again. Thank you so much for joining us today. And we will be praying along with you that this conference goes well and that all will be as it should.
Super. Thank you so much. And if any of your listeners are anywhere near The Hague, they're very welcome. 29th, 30th of March. You can find all the information on our website, think.info.
Thanks for watching. You can listen to this entire podcast on your favorite audio podcast platform. Find the link below. And while you're at it, don't forget to click subscribe and follow us on Facebook so you can stay connected to First Century Foundations.